Hello, everyone. I'm Ruffy. I'm hosting today's show here. So today it's going to be an interview. We have a guest from Prisma, which I'm very, very excited about. It's Nikolas. Um, yeah, so I guess this is my first time on the stream too, so I'll just tell you guys a little bit about myself. I'm an engineer here at Cockroach Labs. I'm on the SQL team. I've been working here about 2 years. And I work on stuff related to SQL, but also third-party tool compatibility. So our goal is to make sure, a lot of the third-party tools that application developers use also work with CockroachDB. So we're starting a partnership off with Prisma. We haven't really gotten to the technical implementation yet, but coming up soon. So both teams here are really excited about that. So we have a great opportunity to chat with someone from Prisma right now. So my guest, Nikolas, can you introduce yourself a little bit and maybe give us one sentence Prisma pitch?
Of course. And thank you for having me on the stream. I'm super excited to chat with you today, Rafi. So my name is Nikolas. I work at Prisma in the developer relations team. And I see it as my role, basically, to help our users understand better what Prisma is and also help them be successful when they're using Prisma. Prisma itself, it's an ORM, an object relational mapper. And the very short tagline I like to tell to application developers is that it makes working with databases easy. And I think we'll get a little bit more into the details, but just as kind of this high-level statement, what Prisma is today, it really is an ORM, and it should make the lives of application developers that are working with databases a bit better, a bit easier. So yeah, that's kind of the short version of it.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot more. I guess we were just chatting before this, but one thing that I'm also a little bit personally interested in Prisma, because what you were saying about making developers' lives easier is something that I definitely believe in. I mean, everyone should believe in that, I hope. But before working here, I was also more of a back-end application developer. So I've definitely been through the pains of kind of fighting my ORM, not really doing what I want, and sometimes just giving up and avoiding ORMs entirely so I could just write SQL queries. I feel like it would be great if there was if I had a solution like Prisma that could have made things much more easy to develop my stuff.
It's interesting how sometimes as an application developer, you end up then in the domain of developer tooling because you kind of want to scratch your own itches, right? You're like, okay, now I've built 3 applications, but it feels like I've always done the same and always kind of followed the same kind of patterns. And now I actually want to make sure that in the future, I don't have to run through these same kind of problems again and want to solve these on a high level. And that's how you end up then building developer tools rather than kind of tools for end users. So yeah, I've got a very similar path there.
Exactly. So I guess I have some background with Prisma, but maybe we could start off with if you could explain, I don't know, what would somebody who's completely new to ORMs or Prisma in general, what do they need to know about what it does?
Yeah. So on a really high level, if you've not worked with ORMs yet and you only have a fairly rough picture of what it would be used for, let's start on a very high level and just consider kind of the traditional 3-tier architecture that's really the standard for most web applications, where you have a front end. In most cases, that's going to be a web app or maybe a mobile app on some smartphone. Then you have an application server and the database, and that's commonly kind of referred as the backend of your application. And the way, of course, how these 3 components interact is by sending messages to each other. From the front end to the application server or API server, that's typically a protocol like HTTP, where you send requests from one another and you receive responses. And that API server, that has to be implemented as well. It has to implement certain behaviors, has to implement business logic, and all that kind of stuff. So you need application developers that are building these API servers. And what these application developers have to do when they're building the API server is they need to write code that is querying a database for the right data that is going to be returned to the client when it's being requested. So that's the task of an application developer. And when they do this, when they have to talk to a database to get the data, the right data in an efficient way and in the right structure, that's when they have different approaches that they can take for this particular task. And it also depends on like somewhat what kind of database you're using. So there are object databases or relational databases and a couple of others like graph databases. But Prisma today only supports relational databases. But we already have the early access version for MongoDB ready. So we are expanding Prisma support also to bring it to other database types. Cool. But coming back to the application developer that is implementing the API server and that has to talk to a database, I think on a high level, there are three ways for them to do that. The most straightforward approach, and one that you already mentioned, Rafi, was to just write plain SQL queries, where they would write select star from users, and then they get all the user records from that table, and they can do with whatever they need in order to return it to the client application as requested that. Writing plain SQL might not be the ideal way for application developers, though. It's on a very low level of abstraction. It's fairly error prone because the way how that works typically is that you just write plain strings inside of your application. You don't get any syntax highlighting, you don't get auto-completion, you don't have a compiler that's checking that you don't have any type of that string. So it's really not the best developer experience. And I think another problem with that is that SQL, while it's very, very powerful, it's also very complex. And it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot with it. In my experience, kind of SQL itself is really not the best abstraction for an application developer to work with. And they should look out for kind of higher level abstractions that are making their life easier in the majority of cases. But of course, there are edge cases when you have to drop down to raw SQL, and the abstractions should still allow you to do that. If we climb up the abstraction ladder a little bit, the next thing that we'll find are so-called SQL query builders. These are libraries in the JavaScript world. There is a popular one that's called Next.js, and these SQL query builders, they still ultimately let you write SQL, but you don't write the SQL as plain strings anymore, but instead you can compose your SQL queries with certain functions. So you wouldn't write select star from user in a string anymore. Instead, you would probably call a function that's called .select, and then as a parameter, you can provide the user table or something like this, and then it spits out the SQL string. So that already provides a little bit of a better experience, but it's still fairly low level, and it's not kind of the most productive approach, I think, for application developers to work with databases. And then on the highest level of abstractions are these object relational mappers, ORMs. And the traditional ways how ORMs work is that you represent the tables in your database as classes in your programming languages. Then you instantiate these classes and you call methods on these classes in order to read and write to the database. And under the hood, the ORM then generates the SQL statements for you. Prisma, on a high level, is similar to that. It provides you a high-level API that's kind of object-based, that lets developers think in objects. So they don't have to change their mental model when they think about their data in the database compared to the data in their programming language. I think that's a big benefit of an ORM in general. But Prisma really takes it to the next level by basically generating a completely type-safe database client for you, and also providing a really nice way to model data rather than having to use classes. You can actually use a very intuitive and human-readable modeling language that Prisma provides for modeling your data.
Yeah, the thing that you said there at the end is, I think, what really, I mean, that always was the appeal to me, is just like, yeah, if somebody has the ability to stay with working with the language that they already know, and the tool they're using actually can handle it, then they don't have to jump into learning a whole new abstraction layer. So I feel like that's sort of if I'm getting what you're saying, like that's sort of the mission of Prisma, is to allow people to remain at their level of abstraction of the application rather than thinking about the database.
Yeah, and like the key term here really is, I think, thinking in objects, because as a JavaScript or as a TypeScript developers, the mental model you have of your data typically is that of nested structures, right? When you have, let's take the typical user and post example, where you like maybe have a blogging application with users and posts. As a JavaScript or TypeScript developer, you're used to seeing user objects that have a nested array of posts, for example. But this is not how the data is represented in the underlying database. In a relational database, you would have two separate tables. The data is physically stored in these two tables. It's not that the posts of a user are physically located directly next to each user record. So it's a different mental model of how to think about the data in each domain and each layer. And the object relational mapper does exactly that. It maps from the relational structure in the relational database to the object-oriented structure in the programming language.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I think you touched on this before, but yeah, so Prisma is it correct me if I'm wrong, but it works with both JavaScript and TypeScript languages, right? So
yes, exactly.
Yeah, I guess. And go on, actually.
We actually also already have already in early access a Go client for Prisma as well. So we are bringing Prisma to more languages just beyond the Node.js system. But yeah, today, if you want to use it in production, then you really can only do that with JavaScript and TypeScript. But in terms of TypeScript, we are certainly the one that provides the strongest type safety guarantees. We actually have a page in our documentation for anyone that's interested, where we compare ourselves with TypeORM and outline different scenarios where Prisma can provide stronger type safety guarantees than TypeORM. For example, when it comes to retrieving partial models or like relations, the results of Prisma queries will always be fully typed. And with TypeORM, a lot of the time, the fields that you have on your models, they will exist at runtime as just optional fields that might or might not be there. But as a developer at development time, you have no way of knowing if the field exists. So you still have to do the non-null checks in order to be really sure.
Right. Actually, that gets to a question that I was sort of curious about, which is, so obviously we talked about how you're sort of mapping objects to the relational model. So where would you say like the source of truth lies? Is it within the application code that is sort of defining the structure of these objects, or is it from the database schemas? And well, I'll have some follow-ups, but yeah, so like where is the source of truth on how the data is really represented?
Right. There are two ways to use Prisma. I'll talk about the main approach first. But just on a high level, it could be either one. The source of truth could be in the Prisma modeling language, or it could be from the database. And I'll explain the two approaches. But the way how Prisma is basically intended to be used is that you have this, the Prisma schema, we're calling it. It uses a modeling language that is very similar to GraphQL SDL, actually. And this has also a little bit to do with our history as a company. Before working on Prisma, we had a different product that was called GraphQL, that was a big hit in the GraphQL ecosystem. And we took a lot of inspiration from kind of the ease of working with GraphQL, and like really looked closely at what developers liked about GraphQL and tried to use these insights to improving how developers would work with databases. And one thing that we found was super appealing about GraphQL was the modeling language, GraphQL SDL. It's super intuitive. Anybody, even like non-technical people that are looking at a GraphQL schema in SDL, they will understand what this is. It's not cryptic. It's very human readable. And when we developed Prisma, we actually went one step further and took kind of the best parts of GraphQL SDL and adapted it to be a more generic modeling language that is able to model any kind of database, basically. So at the core of every Prisma project, you'll always start with this Prisma schema where you model your data. Speaking of a relational database, for example, if you wanted to have a user and a post table inside of your database, you would create two models inside the Prisma schema, like these would be like model user, model post, and then you can add a number of fields to that. So you really just start out with that single file, a Prisma schema. Then you install the Prisma CLI. And the Prisma CLI, it enables various workflows. The first important workflow is database migrations. So what you can do is you can invoke a CLI command. Prisma migrate dev is one that you typically get started with that will generate a SQL migration based on the Prisma schema. And also, if you want to execute that migration already. If you don't want to immediately execute that migration, that's possible as well. You can just generate the .sql file. You can edit it if you want to make any customizations. But this will become part of your migration history. It will be tracked by Prisma Migrate over time. That's the one side, how Prisma, or like how the Prisma schema kind of impacts the database. It goes from the Prisma schema down to the database. And the second workflow that you do with Prisma, with the Prisma CLI that is also based on the Prisma schema, is the generation of a Prisma client. So like Prisma client is this client for your database that I had mentioned before, that's being auto-generated. That means we literally generate code for you that is aware of all of your data structures in the database of all your models, of all your tables. And it generates a really nice and intuitive data access API that you can use to then query the database, to read data, to write data. And the cool thing is that, like, because we're using TypeScript, and if you're also like using TypeScript in your application, you'll get a lot of type safety benefits, because thanks to the fact that we know the Prisma schema and we know which fields are optional, which fields are relations, we can actually generate a really, really nice API that makes it very easy for developers to query their databases. So that's kind of the one major workflow. You always start with a Prisma schema, and then you map your Prisma models to the database with Prisma Migrate, and you generate Prisma client for your application. But there is a second way how you can use Prisma if you don't want to use Prisma's migrations and you don't really like the data modeling experience that you get with Prisma. Though I have to say, I haven't met a person that actually fell into that category. So far, it's rather that a lot of people are initially kind of repelled because they say, why do I have to learn this new language? But as soon as they start actually modeling their data with Prisma, they often turn around and become our biggest advocates. So I've seen a couple of instances of that already, and it's always pretty funny when that happens. But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to use Prisma's modeling language, you can still just migrate your database with your favorite migration tool, and then introspect the database to generate the Prisma schema, and then in turn generate Prisma client. So in that case, the source of truth for all your data would be the database and the SQL tables that you create in the first place. And if you're using kind of the default path, then the Prisma schema is going to be the source of truth of what your data structures look like.
Yeah, interesting to have two options. I mean, I think one thing that stands out to me about that is, I'm guessing, but again, tell me if I'm wrong, that if you sort of just rely on the database and generate everything based off of that, you sort of lose some of the ability to create I guess, maybe richer data structures of maybe how the tables might join to each other and reference each other in the representation of the model.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There are, of course, a couple of conventions that we use at Prisma, for example, to represent relations in the data model, right? If we go back to the user post model, say we also have like a category model, so that posts can be in a certain category. That's typically like a many-to-many relationship. And in a relational database, the way how many-to-many relationships are typically modeled is with this join table or junction table, relation table, whatever you want to call that. But it's a table that just stores foreign keys for both the category and the post tables. And then each row represents basically one relation unit, so to say. It connects two records from both tables. And when you model your data with Prisma in the first place, then you don't have to think about this relation table because it will be generated and maintained for you under the hood. And you can just basically model your data with two kind of square brackets to indicate that these are arrays that point to a different model. And you can just omit the relation table in your Prisma schema. But you can also, if you follow the conventions that Prisma has for relation tables, and if you build your own relation table, if you start at the SQL level and if you build your own relation table according to these conventions, then when introspecting the database, the Prisma schema that's being generated will actually still show you this nice many-to-many relationship, and it will not render the relation table itself. And also on the API level, you will also get just a very nice API to directly traverse from post to category, and you don't have to always take the detour to pass the relation table as well.
Cool. Yeah, so I wanted to get back to something you mentioned earlier about GraphQL. So yeah, the roots of the company are sort of based on GraphQL. So sort of do people need to know about GraphQL before getting started with Prisma? And does GraphQL come up anywhere else in how Prisma works?
That's a really good question, and it's a definite no. So people don't have to be familiar with GraphQL in order to get started with Prisma. They really don't have to care about GraphQL at all. The way how they should think about Prisma is really just as an ORM that solves problems with their database, but it doesn't give you any benefits that you are an expert in GraphQL when you're using Prisma. But it's definitely right that I think the name Prisma of the company is still somewhat associated with GraphQL. And that's indeed because of the history we had as a company. We went through kind of three major product iterations up until the point where we arrived now. So the very first product that we had over 4 years ago was called GraphQL, and it really was a backend as a service that exposed a GraphQL API. So it was a website or like a web app. You could log in, and then you could model your data. Just in a web UI, you could say, okay, I want this user model, I want this post model, and then what the GraphQL backend as a service would do under the hood is it would generate the database for you and the GraphQL API for you, and it was ready to use for front-end developers. But we found that this was it was nice. People liked it. But when it came to building kind of mission-critical applications, people often shied away from using Prisma. And it was rather seen as like a toy. It was also at a time when GraphQL was still super new. So a lot of people just used it to learn GraphQL. But the main feedback we got for GraphQL once people were done kind of prototyping their app was like, okay, thank you. I'm done here. I'm now going to build this myself because I'm building a real app. And of course, that's not what we wanted to hear, and also not kind of the problems we actually wanted to solve. We wanted to solve real developers' problems that would build kind of the next Twitter, the next Facebook, the next Uber with our tools. And GraphQL was certainly not built for that. So at that time, we decided to basically remove the what we wanted to enable was to give people more flexibility to incorporate their own business logic into the GraphQL API, and also to really do their own API design. And the way how we did that was by basically taking what we had implemented with GraphQL, but just taking basically the GraphQL engine, the part that you put on top of your database and that generated a GraphQL API. So this HTTP layer, a standalone server that would turn a database into a GraphQL API. So that was Prisma 1. We launched that, I think, in 2018 or so. And the idea that's counterintuitive to a lot of people that have worked with GraphQL and that know that GraphQL ultimately is a technology for front-end developers to easily get the data from various data sources. The counterintuitive part to that notion in Prisma 1 was that the GraphQL API that was generated for the database was actually not supposed to be used by front-end developers, but it was supposed to be used by another API server that would be put on top of this again. So we kind of turned the traditional 3-tier architecture into a 4-tier architecture, where now suddenly in between your API server and your database, you had this Prisma server that turned the database into a GraphQL API. And this GraphQL API was just a powerful CRUD API that would be used by the API developers so that they wouldn't have to write SQL, but so that they could write GraphQL basically to talk to the database. And while that solved a lot of the problems that people had before, so they were now able to implement their own business logic much easier. They could really decide what their own GraphQL API should look like. It didn't solve, or it brought about more problems, I would say. And that was like, on the one hand, they had to host this additional Prisma server. So they had to host another infrastructure component. Another problem was just the mental model for thinking about this. So it wasn't intuitive, as I mentioned, that the GraphQL API that was generated by Prisma suddenly wasn't supposed to be used by front-end developers anymore, but was for back-end developers. And also in terms of type safety. So I think from the start at Prisma, we have been huge fans of type safety and really always tried to go a long way to enable developers to really get all the benefits of type safety when they're building applications. And that kind of led us to the next major iteration of Prisma, when we understood that at that point, the main problem that we were solving for people was not the quick provisioning of a GraphQL API, but it was that we liberated folks from worrying about their database. Because the way how that worked with Prisma 1 was that they modeled their database with the GraphQL SDL, and that they could query the database with GraphQL as well. And apparently people liked that. But then we found or thought that, okay, but GraphQL is really not the best kind of abstraction when it's just about solving the problems of database workflows. With this problem, or like with this solution, we are kind of right next to other ORMs in the space, like TypeORM, like Sequelize. But there are so many more friction points with Prisma compared to these. And the most common feedback point we got from folks was, okay, but I just need an ORM. Why do I have this additional server here? That was not what I signed up for. So we tried to solve that problem. And that led us to Prisma 2, where the additional infrastructure component has been removed. Under the hood, there still are traces from GraphQL. If you dig really deep into Prisma under the hood, there are still like traces from kind of the initial idea of this kind kind of GraphQL server that turns your database into a GraphQL API, but this is now wrapped into a single binary that's packaged up inside the Prisma client NPM package. So as a developer, you won't even notice that it's there, but it's running alongside your application, and that's the part of Prisma that's also doing the heavy lifting, kind of translating queries from Prisma client that you just wrote in JavaScript down to SQL.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think I guess I'm just curious. Can people use that sort of functionality for any like debugging or sort of manual introspection? I feel like GraphQL is like really flexible, so I wonder if like that's exposed in any way.
It's not officially exposed. If you start kind of peeling off these layers, then you'll be completely on your own. This is not officially supported. It's also not like officially documented. But yeah, it's there, and like Prisma is entirely open source. So if anyone is inclined to really find out how things are working under the hood, if they're curious, they are of course more than welcome to dig in. But yeah, that's just like internals, implementation details that the regular application developer shouldn't need to worry about.
I understand. Yeah, I think my curiosity is leading me down a dark path potentially, but yeah, it's always cool to know how stuff happens under the hood. So yeah, thanks for that. So you mentioned a lot about like what your users were really wanting. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about like, I don't know, who are your users or like their personas, and like what are you finding from the community of people who use Prisma? What are they doing with it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in theory, like Prisma, because it's just an abstraction layer for a database, it really can be used in any application that talks to a database. So like in that sense, wherever you imagine a database to be present, that's a potential use case for Prisma. So be it an e-commerce shop, be it a social network, be it a blogging system, whatever you have, Prisma would be a potential candidate to solve this. And yeah, it just makes lives of application developers easier. And it's actually interesting because like I don't know that we have a typical persona for Prisma. With GraphQL, I think that was still a little bit different because in the GraphQL days, it was very much catering to front-end developers, and B, it was also in the very early GraphQL days. So we were kind of like riding the hype wave there a little bit, and the way how we sometimes referred to our main persona back in the day was the node hipster. That's like always after the latest technology, and just wants to be on the cutting edge, basically. But I think with Prisma, this has really shifted, and we don't have that one persona anymore, and we are catering to all kind of experience levels. Of course, I think Prisma is very appealing especially to newcomers that don't even have experience with SQL, but that want to work with a database, just because it makes it a lot easier to actually work with a database. You don't have to use all the or like learn all the nitty-gritty of SQL, but you can fairly quickly get started with your own database, and probably for the first couple of weeks don't even have to worry about the SQL part of it. That being said, I know a lot of like SQL experts really that are huge fans of Prisma as well, thanks to the productivity gains that they get with it. Because like as we already talked before, like SQL is fairly cumbersome to work with, and even if you're an expert with it, it's still rare, I think, that you feel super productive using it. And as soon as you're on a team where people have different experience levels with SQL, this also gets more difficult. And like especially when talking to these kind of SQL experts, I think the points that they typically mention is like on the one hand the productivity gains, and then also the type safety, because getting a similar level of type safety when you're just using plain SQL or query builders is just like super, super difficult if you're not using Prisma. And I think in that sense, it's even appreciated by people that are really experienced with SQL already, that when needed would just drop down to write their own SQL. So of course we provide these escape hatches because of course there will be cases where the SQL queries that are generated by Prisma are not the most efficient ones. And for these cases, it should always be possible to drop down to raw SQL. But this is also just problems that people, in my experience, also are worrying about way too early. It's kind of this the premature optimization where like you're just building your first prototype and you're kind of already like thinking about, okay, how do I scale this to 2 million users? That's of course not the productive way of thinking as a developer. And yeah, so in that sense, I think Prisma really covers a broad range of developers that are using it very happily.
Nice. Yeah, that to me is huge, because I think one of my frustrations with other ORMs that is like it sort of locks you in. Like I agreed, like I didn't want to prematurely optimize anything, but I feel like once you go down a track of using an ORM for whatever, generating these queries, then sometimes it's hard to do what you're saying and drop into just writing a more efficient SQL query. But the fact that Prisma lets you do that, I think, is like really compelling. And like you're saying, it'll appeal to sort of a wide range of developers and expertise. That's cool. That's cool. So yeah, I think I just wanted to make sure. So we've talked about a Prisma client and how that generates a client for you. And you mentioned Prisma Migrate as well. So are there any other products that you guys offer that people could use with Prisma?
Right. Yeah. So I think one thing I like maybe really haven't pointed out yet, but the Prisma ORM that we're talking about right now, so mostly Prisma Client and Prisma Migrate, they're both open source. Yet we are a commercial company that eventually will have to make money. We are VC funded. So we are currently also working on a bigger project that we're calling the Prisma Data Platform. I'll talk about this in a second, but there is a third component to the Prisma ORM, and that's Prisma Studio. And Prisma Studio is basically just a very nice and modern UI for your database that lets you view the data as tables and basically edit the data in there with the ease of a spreadsheet. And it's really kind of like a modern version of PHP and a couple of these other database tools that always feel like they've been built in the 90s and really haven't made the cut to like modern developer tools. Like Prisma Studio is basically our answer to this, and it comes with every Prisma project. So as soon as you install your Prisma CLI, as soon as you set up your Prisma schema, you can open Prisma Studio. You can either download the desktop app, or if you want to run it inside the browser, you can run the Prisma Studio command with the Prisma CLI, and it'll open up in the browser. So yeah, that's the third component that's available today. And then, as I mentioned, we build the Prisma Data Platform. That's a little bit more like sophisticated, I would say. And that's what eventually we'll also kind of monetize. And that's primarily also a way, I think, to make it easier to collaborate on projects that are using the open source Prisma components. So it's targeted more at development teams, at larger organizations, at enterprises. And we also have this vision of like a data mesh where you have this additional data access layer between your database and the application server that, again, kind of liberates developers from things that are important in large applications like audit logging, like debugging, like monitoring, and like these kinds of things that as an application developer who kind of needs to deliver value to the organization are not really the things that you want to like worry about every day and that you want to spend a lot of time on because you want to implement features. So that is what we want to solve with that.
Nice. I'm definitely excited to see where that goes. So yeah, you mentioned how sort of the goal, or the sort of long-term mission here has been just to get people comfortable with using this in production. So like what are the new features that have been sort of rolling out recently with the Prisma suite of tools that I don't know, that are a step over what wasn't there before?
Yeah. So the biggest feature that we launched like roughly a month ago, I think, was like Prisma Migrate, and that completed the Prisma ORM suite, if you want. So that was like Prisma Client. We already launched in June last year, Prisma Studio, I think, in October, and now Prisma Migrate followed in February or March, and that made the Prisma ORM itself complete. Then we also just last week launched the first version of the Prisma Data Platform, which is really just an online data browser. So we kind of took the data browser component from Prisma Studio and we made it available in a collaborative environment. So like while I painted a big picture with a big vision for what the Prisma Data Platform is eventually going to be, if you look at it today, it's kind of a glorified online data browser that your team can connect to and can collaborate on the database. But of course, things are going to evolve quickly from there. In terms of other features, I think it's always interesting to look also at the things that are coming up in each of these tools specifically. So like Prisma Client, a couple of features. I can't think of any specific big features that recently came for Prisma Client, to be honest. I think the API has been stabilized already quite a bit over the past year, and for the past couple of weeks and months, I think the Prisma Client team has been very focused on expanding our database support. So bringing Prisma to more databases, and especially MongoDB. So that's like one of our major focus areas at the moment, to enable type-safe database access for MongoDB as well. And one thing that I'm personally curious about what we'll come up with, and I don't know, we're super active on GitHub. If anyone of like the listeners right now has ideas, please share them in feature requests. What a tool like Prisma Migrate would do in a object-oriented database where there is no schema. Is there even a need for like a migration system? Because we now slap the schema layer on top of the object-oriented unstructured database, basically. So that's an interesting question to think about, just as a thought exercise, I think. So the first version of MongoDB support that we're currently working on will only support Prisma Client.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about how it seems like the most important and valuable thing to work on is sort of just enhancing support for across the board for all the databases that are out there. I imagine MongoDB is like a huge user base there that you could tap into.
Yes, and it's like certainly one of our most commonly requested features. And like it's funny when you're in when you're always in touch with your community. Like I am also through various live streams or on like sometimes on Reddit, or like when like we were posted on Hacker News like 2 weeks ago, I think. Then you can bet that one of the first questions is, when is MongoDB support ready? So we like finally have a good answer, because that has been a question for the past 2 years since we launched the initial version of Prisma.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely that definitely happens when you have a pulse on the community. Yeah, I'm curious how it goes. Yeah, just because as you're saying, like a lot of the other databases are all relational and SQL, so it seems like a big shift. I guess either with Mongo specifically or even with in general with other databases, are there like certain pain points that um, Prisma itself sort of runs into trying to add support for these that are sort of recurring issues that you wish could be better?
So you mean like the problems that developers have with these database types if they weren't using Prisma?
No, sorry. I actually mean from the within internally to Prisma. Like, is there any challenges that uh,
Mm.
come up as you guys add more support for new databases? Like, do you see, um, what sort of challenges do you run into when adding support for databases?
I am sure that there are many of these challenges, but I'm also not the best person to speak to them because I don't encounter them in my everyday work life. But I can still talk to it maybe on a high level and from my perspective. I think that now the biggest challenge is indeed that MongoDB object-oriented databases are just following a fundamentally different paradigm than relational databases. And it's unclear how to kind of map some behaviors from relational databases with Prisma to MongoDB. One example is transactions, and another example is nested objects or embedded objects, which also a little bit goes back to the conversations we had before about how relations are represented in relational databases and in object-oriented programming languages. It's the same principle in MongoDB, where you also just co-locate the data for your relations oftentimes and do not kind of reference it via foreign keys. So like thinking about mapping or like how would an idiomatic way for working with relations now look like with MongoDB that we can bring to the Prisma layer? I think that's like certainly a challenge that our developers and our product teams are thinking about. Then just like the same question I just put out, do we even need Prisma Migrate for MongoDB? What would its role be? It would certainly do something very different compared to what it does with like relational databases. It would probably be more concerned with just data migrations in a certain sense. But yeah, that's I think some problems are
yeah, for sure. One thing that I again, just sort of adding it to my wish list is like the whole idea you mentioned of how sometimes you might run into a query that doesn't perform well, so user might have to write SQL directly. I think it would be, I imagine there's a lot of potential there for Prisma to sort of like gain the smarts about how to write more efficient queries and even abstract that level of logic away from the users as well.
Yeah. Exactly, and if we actually think about the commercial product that we'll eventually build, I think it's very likely that in some way it'll hook into the Prisma query engine, so the thing that actually generates the SQL queries. And you could think of functionalities like, okay, like this is like the SQL queries that are being generated by Prisma are being monitored, and then you can kind of potentially configure an alarm that tells you, hey, you should really put an index on this column in the database because the queries of that like have gotten slower over time, and it's like a highly requested query pattern, and like that's now what you should think about optimizing. So I think we are in a really good position there to help developers understand their query patterns. I think that's really like core, like really core to it. That you have to understand what your application is querying, how often it's querying that, and that information you can use for proper optimizations. And we're in a really, really good spot to provide that.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me. And this is also not the area that I work on, but yeah, I do know like there's definitely like an initiative within CockroachDB as well to sort of provide that same sort of view where, the database obviously knows what sort of queries are coming in, and I think our ideal would be that we could provide that sort of advice to users as well. So I think it's great that this problem can be approached from both sides, and potentially even like as as the CockroachDB partnership continues, like maybe it's something that we could work on together.
Yeah, for
hopefully.
Sure.
Yeah. So what do you see happening next with Prisma? Both like upcoming short term, but like where would you want to see the product? Maybe like 2 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also a really good question. I think we will keep expanding the functionality of the open source tools because they are really the foundation of people that are using Prisma. But of course, as I mentioned, we'll eventually also have to make money as a company. And so the commercial aspect and the Prisma data platform will play a huge role. And it's like sometimes funny because the approach that we are taking as a commercial open source company is that we cannot tell you yet what the product is going to be in 2 years. Mostly because we are now talking to our users to understand the problems that they have and that they would pay money to have solved for them. We have a big user base already, and one point of feedback we actually often get is, hey, this is so amazing, this saves me so much time, but I can't pay you any money at the moment. Why not? And like, how can I do that? And of course, that's because today all the tools are open source. Like nobody's paying us a dime. But of course, in the future, we'll build these commercial tools that make it will solve like various problems that people have today. But yeah, it's really on a step-by-step like step-by-step basis how we're approaching this.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that, as long as you guys have the opportunity to be so responsive to the users, then letting them sort of control the roadmap, I think, seems like the ideal, at least for the users. I guess on that note, are there any sort of like, I don't know, I'm curious, like, what are your favorite experiences with users, and do you have like any good stories that you'd like to share?
My favorite experiences, I think, are always when Prisma is being posted on Reddit or on Hacker News, and there is a mob that is just basically getting furious about like various aspects, and then I like often see it as my role to kind of like jump in, and like, it's very funny when you have a very kind of rage comment about Prisma where people are complaining, maybe they're using strong language, and then you respond to them with just like a very kind of like friendly and polite tone, and you also kind of actually appreciate the feedback points that they are bringing up, because a lot of the time what people are pointing out, the criticism is absolutely valid, and like I want to acknowledge that, and I want to make sure that we're addressing it. It's just the way how it's presented oftentimes feels a little bit it's just not the way how people would probably talk if they were in a room with each other. And responding to these people in a polite way has led to a couple of really nice experiences, actually, where people then like in turn thank me for a nice response and for actually taking their criticisms like seriously. And like maybe inspired them to be a little bit more friendly the next time they're posting about something. So I think these are always kind of my favorite experiences.
To me, that's very admirable. I think you're maybe the first person I've met who enjoys entering into an internet flame war while diffusing it, as you're saying there, rather than adding fuel to the fire. I don't know if I have the patience to engage with angry internet people all the time.
Yeah, actually, patience is a really good word. It's exactly what you need in a lot of instances when you're working with users.
Nice. Yeah, we have maybe 5 minutes left here. I guess I've been sort of grilling you all the time, but yeah, just wanted to maybe we could talk about anything that you're curious about with CockroachDB and like how how it could fit in with Prisma at a high level. If you wanted to maybe ask me anything about that.
Yeah, of course. We touched also briefly on this in when we chatted before the stream, and I think like one problem that a lot of Prisma users have today is when they're deploying their applications to a serverless architecture, for example, with AWS Lambda, and then they are still running a traditional database like Postgres or MySQL. And the problem there is that these serverless environments, they're really built for stateless applications, right? But as soon as a traditional database enters the game, you all of a sudden have like a stateful component to it, because the connection from your application to the database requires the stateful connection. And that's not a problem that's inherent to Prisma. It's a problem that's inherent to people that use serverless with traditional databases. And there are solutions to that, like PG Bouncer. But I'm curious what you kind of at Cockroach like think about this, and what you maybe have in store to solve that problem for developers.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely an area that we started to think about more over the past year, I'd say, especially within my team. So yeah, in addition to working with third-party tools, I think my team also works a lot on sort of the experience of connecting to the database and yeah, just the journey of how a user might initially interact with the database. And what you're saying is definitely a real concern in the sort of serverless architecture. We've had a lot of sort of like user interviews and just like feedback from people who run in serverless environments, and we've seen a lot of approaches there. In some cases, they just sort of, as you say, they don't worry about it yet and try not to prematurely optimize. So they sort of just take the hit of adding those extra connections each time the serverless instance spins up. One thing that we have started to do a little bit more recently is actually test out PG Bouncer with CockroachDB as well. So one, I guess, important fact about CockroachDB is that it speaks the same wire protocol as Postgres. So all of the tools that, or our goal is that all of the tools that work with Postgres should sort of be generally compatible with CockroachDB as well. And PG Bouncer is a great candidate for the reason that you mentioned. In a serverless environment, it can sort of serve as the connection pool that is stateful, while all of the stateless applications spin up and down without having to worry about managing the connection. So we've tested with that, and yeah, overall, I think there's like enough compatibility for us to continue. We're still like in the process of doing this, but our goal is just to sort of present more documentation and sort of recipes and examples for how somebody might use this in a serverless setting with CockroachDB. And one other area, which I think is maybe what you were touching on, is we recently launched our free tier of CockroachDB, and this is sort of I wouldn't say it relates directly to an application serverless architecture, but it's related in the sense that it's sort of our version of a dynamically scaling CockroachDB. So it also handles things like spinning up and down CockroachDB SQL nodes, so that users can, in this version, don't have to pay anything just because there's resource caps and bandwidth constraints. But when they're not using the database just scales down to 0 entirely. And of course, there's a shared architecture which allows people to, which allows us to sort of save on costs of running the infrastructure. Yeah, and in this version of the architecture, we also have some of these same problems where, as we scale down the database nodes, we also want to maintain the connection somewhere statefully. So we sort of are introducing a component of the architecture that can do that, and it's sort of a proxy layer that sits in front of our database that we still operate, but it can sort of have the intelligence to manage these connections that are scaling up and down all the time.
Nice. Super interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing more of that, and of course, one day the Prisma cockroach integration. When that is ready, I think we'll meet here again, and then we'll do a demo and show folks a little bit how Prisma and cockroach can be used together.
Certainly. Yeah, thanks so much for chatting with me. I think we're coming to the end here. I guess before we go, is there any resources or links that I don't know you would want to direct people to?
So if people want to get started, I think the best way is just to go to our homepage on prisma.io. There is a big button to the quick start that you can just follow that sets you up with a SQLite database. So really has no prerequisites for you to get started. If you already have your own MySQL or Postgres server like running and you want to connect Prisma to that, we also have a getting started tutorial for that. And even if you have an existing database, you just want to play around with Prisma a little bit, see how it feels, you can also just go ahead and introspect Prisma, introspect the database, generate your Prisma client, and start querying a little bit to see what it feels like. So Prisma.io, I think, is the best place. We also have a YouTube channel where we do regular live streams as well. I would be happy if anyone wants to drop by there at some point as well. But yeah, I think that's it from my side.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nikolas. Great chatting with you for this hour. And yeah, definitely hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you, Rafi. Have a good day. Cheers.